Hey guys, I'm BTC, and this lovely lady right here is Daisy. She is a really nice kitty. Really good kitty. I'd like to tell you the story of my cat Daisy. Daisy was a really good pet, but on top of that, she helped me keep a connection to my grandmother, who passed away in 2004. Now, unfortunately, Daisy herself passed away last year on Christmas Eve of 2013. It's taken me a little while to make this video because every time I would start going through the pictures or the footage I had, I would be reminded of the last couple days of Daisy's life, and I would just lose motivation to make this video. But I feel that Daisy was a really good pet, and she was important to me and my grandmother, and she deserves to have her story be told. So it starts about 18 years ago. I'm told that Daisy began as a stray, which is probably why she was really skittish around people for nearly all of her life. She was taken in by a friend of my grandmother, who didn't have Daisy for too long because my grandmother's friend would pass away. So my grandmother took care of Daisy, and she had her for quite a few years until my grandmother herself became too ill to live on her own. So she moved in with my mother, and she brought Daisy with her. Eventually, my grandmother's health would continue to decline to the point where she could no longer live with my mother. My mother wasn't able to take care of her and all of her health issues at that point. So my grandmother went to a senior living facility, and Daisy stayed with my mother because they didn't allow pets. Eventually, my grandmother would pass away in 2004 while I was deployed to Iraq. I didn't receive word of my grandmother's death until a couple days after, at which point it was impossible for me to make it back in time for a funeral. But prior to deploying, I went and saw my grandmother, and I thanked her for everything she had done for me. My grandmother was a wonderful person. She was incredibly kind and caring, and she did a tremendous amount of stuff for not only her children but also her grandchildren. And my grandmother meant a lot to me. So it was pretty devastating when I read in an email while deployed that she had passed away. But I was very glad that I had gone to see her before I deployed and let her know how much she meant to me. Unfortunately, at that point, my grandmother had deteriorated to the point where she really didn't know who most people were, and she didn't really understand where she was or what was going on. It was hard to see her like that. And prior to deploying, I didn't know if one of us would pass away before I got to come home. As it turns out, I made it back safe, but my grandmother wasn't there when I came back. So Daisy stayed with my mother for a few years, and I continued my time in the Army. Eventually, I would finish my active duty and come home, and I started to go to college, and I lived with my mother and my stepfather and my sister while I was going to college. Now, eventually, I would finish, well, I wouldn't quite finish college, but I got a good enough job and what have you that I was ready to move out again. And Daisy was getting really old at this point, and she had arthritis, and she had a hard time going up and down the stairs, and I told my mother and my stepfather that Daisy needed to go to the vet, and they said, well, we can't really get her in the cat carrier. I said, okay, fine, I will bring her to the vet, but after I do, I'm bringing her to my place, and I'm taking care of her from now on, because she's going to need vet visits. So I took care of Daisy. I brought her to my new apartment, and for most of Daisy's life, she was very much secluded. She kept to herself. She would go into the rooms where nobody went. She would go downstairs or go into the living room, and that's not where people were. So she was by herself for a lot of the time. But when she was living with me, well, my apartment isn't very big, so she was almost always with me. And in the last couple years of her life, she became a lot more friendly. I'm not entirely sure how she acted around my grandmother, but I know when she was at my mother's house, she didn't get too much attention. But when she lived with me, she got tons of attention, and Daisy really enjoyed it. She would usually be sitting right on the couch next to me when I was recording for YouTube or just whatever, watching TV or something. And she was almost always there when I fell asleep and there when I woke up. So she was a really good cat. She was also the last thing that I had of my grandmother. You know, there's a couple of pictures here and there, but Daisy was kind of a connection to my grandmother. And since I wasn't there when she passed away, I felt kind of an obligation to take care of Daisy. It was pretty hard when Daisy finally went because it was fairly sudden. I had brought her to the vet on a couple of occasions and got her medicine for arthritis and asthma and whatever else. But all of a sudden she started losing weight very, very quickly. If you look in some of the pictures or video that I've been showing, you'll see that she went from being around 12 to 13 pounds, which was technically overweight, to the time of her death, she was barely 4 pounds. She deteriorated right in front of me. And the last weekend that I had her, I remember on Friday, she threw up probably 6, 7, 8 times. It was quite a bit. And I'm very glad with how I acted, because I knew it wasn't Daisy's fault that she was getting sick, so I tried to comfort her and just make sure she had fluids and what have you. A lot of people tend to yell at their pets when their pets throw up or something, but it's just like a person when they get sick. It's not their fault. So I tried to make her feel better, but she kept throwing up. And then she stopped eating. I noticed the next morning, the other 2 cats, every morning it always happens the same way. My cats drive me nuts, meowing for food, and Daisy wasn't doing that. She was just kind of laying there. I got some canned food for her and put it down, but she wouldn't eat it. So I knew something was wrong. She would eat a little bit of the gravy stuff that comes in the can with the canned cat food. And she kind of licked that, and that's about it. Sunday, she still wouldn't eat, so I started taking the canned cat food and just squeezing all the gravy out of it so she would have something. And she still licked it a little bit. I went and got some Pedialyte and an eyedropper so that I could keep Daisy hydrated. Come the 24th, she had stopped eating altogether. She wouldn't eat anything, not even the gravy. She had almost no strength whatsoever. The day before, the final night that I had her, she was so weak she couldn't even move. She was on the bed and she just kind of like fell over. And I could tell she was in a really uncomfortable position. Her upper body was turned on its side, but her hind legs were still kind of upright. And she didn't have the strength to reposition herself, so I had to pick her up and turn her on her side so that she could lay more comfortably. She purred quite a bit that final night, and I could tell that she was content, and I just kind of laid there and kept her company for a few hours before I eventually fell asleep myself. And then the next day I had to bring her to the vet. It's certainly not an easy thing, but at this point she was dying of starvation, which is a really bad way to go. And the vets told me they couldn't do anything for her, and they recommended putting her to sleep. They said, we'll give you some time, so I took some time. Just prior to that, my dad was with me. It was his mother, so that's why the cat kind of meant something to both of us. And there's a little bench in the veterinary office, and Daisy was on the floor, and she tried to jump up onto the bench, and she couldn't make it. This bench was only a foot, if that. And she jumped kind of a hop. She hit the bench and fell over backwards. Now, you know cats in trouble when they fall on their back instead of landing on their feet. At that point, my dad kind of couldn't take seeing her like that anymore and left the room. So I was there, and I don't know how long I was sitting in the office. They were waiting for me to knock on the door to say it was okay to begin. And I just held her, and I thanked her for all the time she had been with me, and I kept thinking to myself, if this were a person or anybody else, how much would you give for one more day, for one more hour, for 5 more minutes? How much money would somebody be willing to pay to have that little extra time? And I just stood there, standing up near the door, and I didn't knock on it. And I just stood next to the door. I don't know if it was 5 minutes, it could have been 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Going back and forth with myself. How much would I give for an extra hour or an extra day? And I realized that if I brought her home, she would likely not last another day or so, but she would probably be in a decent amount of pain from the starvation and the traumatic weight loss. And I knocked on the door. And I'm sure you know what happens next. And then the vet said they would give me a little bit more time. It may seem silly, but I asked Daisy to forgive me for what I did. She really meant a lot to me, and was the last thing that I had connecting to my grandmother. Now, both of them are just memory, and I miss them.